This is K.M. Weiland, and you are listening to the 315th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. Big landmark reached in my historical superhero work in progress Wayfarer this week. The third plot point, ahoy! This, of course, is the protagonist's personal low moment that begins the third and final act at the 75% mark. So not only is this a super big scene, it also means I'm 3/4 finished with this book. Even though I'm more or less right on schedule, I kind of find that hard to believe. When I'm in the middle of writing a book, it always feels so all-absorbing, like it will be the rest of my life forever. So it's always a little shocking, almost like a dash of cold water in the face, to look up and realize I'm not that far from the finish line. Which also means I'm not that far from getting to start the next book, which in this instance will be my Portal Fantasy Dreamlanders sequel. That is so near at hand is both exciting and kind of a little frightening, but I can't get too far ahead of myself right now. If I stay on course with Wayfarer, I should finish its third act in another 2 months, just in time for the new year. The latest post in the video series on my blog is worried readers won't like your character. This trick equals insta adoration. It talks about the secret sauce you can use when your worried readers won't like your character. All you have to do is add love, really. So to find the post, visit my site at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And now I hope you enjoyed this week's podcast entitled Most Common Writing Mistakes, Part 45, Avoiding Said. What's this, you say? Avoiding said is one of the most common writing mistakes? How can that be? Surely writers overuse this ubiquitous little word more often than not, don't they? As a matter of fact, nope. Indeed, trying to avoid this hardworking little speaker attribution tag can, in most instances, lead you into some major prose problems. If you run a word frequency search through your manuscript, said is probably the verb that shows up the most. And for some writers, that sets off alarm bells in their heads. If a word shows up that frequently, then surely you must be overusing it. Readers will notice its repetition and stumble over it as it clutters your prose. As a result, you might be tempted to start replacing said with more colorful alternatives. After all, writers are always being told to look beyond pedestrian verbs like walked for more specific and showing choices, such as sauntered, limped, marched. So the same must be true of said, right? It's a legit question, so let us take a look. The problem with replacing our little workaday friend said with more flamboyant and specific alternatives is twofold. Problem number one, said alternatives are usually counterproductive in that they end up drawing way more attention to themselves than plain Jane said ever would. Problem number two. Unlike most colorful verbs which work to show readers the action, flashy dialogue tags actually have exactly the opposite effect. Dialogue is arguably the only true form of showing in written fiction, since the words should ideally be able to stand on their own without the author interjecting his own guidance or interpretation. But that's exactly what non-said speaker tags do. They tell readers how to read the dialogue. In most, although definitely not all instances, that's going to drain a little of the vibrancy and immediacy right out of even the best dialogue. Here's an example. Sinead's kids were screaming in the back seat as she drove home from the grocery store. "I want ice cream," Michael shrieked. "Me too," whined Cassandra. "No," Sinead gritted out. "We're going home." "But why?" Michael wailed. "Why?" Cassandra echoed. Sinead's cell phone rang. "Hello," she answered. "You're late," her boss roared. "But," she gasped, "I wasn't even supposed to come into work today." As you can see, even a variety of speaker tags can get repetitious and very silly fast. Okay, so we don't want to overuse non-said tags. Got it. But that brings us right back to our original conundrum. Can you overuse said itself in your dialogue? Short answer, definitely. If we replace all those creative tags from the first example with saids, we've still got problems coming out of our ears. Sinead's kids were screaming in the back seat as she drove home from the grocery store. I want ice cream, Michael said. Me too, said Cassandra. No, Sinead said, we're going home. But why, Michael said. Why, Cassandra said. Sinead's cell phone rang. Hello, she said. You're late, her boss said. But, she said, I wasn't even supposed to come into work today. In all honesty, this is a better choice than the previous example, despite the more obvious repetition, because at least it's not hitting readers over the head with the author's thesaurus. But it's also a perfect example of why authors get twitchy with said. Slather this many saids into dialogue and you're totally right to fear that readers will get annoyed. So, what's the answer? As always, what we're looking for here is a happy medium. There are two things you need to understand about the use of said. Thing to understand, numero uno, when used with wise restraint, said is virtually invisible. So long as the rhythm of your prose is cooperating, you can include said in practically every other line of dialogue, and readers won't notice. Said is a background word, not unlike the, he, she, or your character's name. Use prestidigitation even as many as 4 times in a book, and readers may well take notice. But you can use said over and over again without it ever registering. Thing to understand, numero dos. Just because you can use said with comparative abandon doesn't mean you should. I ran a search in my 143,000 word work in progress. Said shows up 311 times, which honestly kind of shocked me. That's not very often, really, and the reason it doesn't show up more than that is because there are a host of other options at the author's fingertips. The first option is simply going with the minimalist approach and avoiding any kind of speaker tag. Remember, you want your awesome dialogue to stand on its own whenever possible. There are only 3 times you ever need to use a speaker tag. 1, when the speaker needs to be clarified, who is speaking. 2, when the tone needs to be clarified, how is he speaking. And 3, when the rhythm of the prose demands it. And even then, you're always going to want to consider whether or not an action beat might not be the better choice. An action beat indicates an action performed by the speaker in association with his dialogue. Because it references the speaker, it eliminates the need for an identifying speaker tag. And because it often provides context for the dialogue, it can often pull double duty by helping readers understand the tone in which the speaker is talking. Optimally, you're going to want to incorporate a conscious mix of action beats and saids, along with the very occasional alternative speaker tag, to create something like this. Sinead's kids were screaming in the back seat as she drove home from the grocery store. Michael kicked the back of her seat. I want ice cream. Me too, Cassandra said from her car seat. No, Sinead clenched the steering wheel. We're going home. But why, Michael said. Why, Cassandra echoed. Sinead's cell phone rang. Sinead's heart sank. That was going to be bad news. She just knew it. Hello? You're late. Her boss sounded about as happy as a giraffe with a sore throat. On top of everything else, the accusation felt like a blow to her stomach. But I wasn't even supposed to come into work today. Like any tool in your writing bag, said must be used with care, but don't feel you have to avoid it. Common though it may be, said is one of the writer's hardest workers. Indeed, its very commonness is what makes it so useful. Thank you for listening to the Wordplay Podcast. To read a transcript of this episode, you can visit my website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And be sure to check back again next week.